Shocking moment. Karoline Leavitt kicked off Jimmy Kimmel in epic live TV. The lights dimmed on the set of Jimmy Kimmel Live, casting long shadows over the crowd, which buzzed with a mix of anticipation and energy. It wasn't just another late-night show. Tonight, the air was thick with tension. Jimmy Kimmel, the reigning king of comedy, had set the stage for something more, something that could shake the political establishment. On the other side, Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in history, sat in her chair, calm, poised, and ready for battle. Her red suit stood out like a beacon, contrasting with the sleek, dark surroundings of the studio. The spotlight gleamed off her blonde hair as she sat, her hands neatly folded in her lap. She wasn't there to play the fool or entertain with jokes. She was there to represent millions of Americans, to defend the policies of the Trump administration, and to confront the media bias head-on. Kimmel, ever the professional, flashed his signature smile as he prepared to steer the conversation into contentious waters. His eyes gleamed with a mix of mischief and calculated intent. This wasn't just a routine political interview. This was a moment for Kimmel to shine, to make his mark, to expose the flaws of the Trump administration through sharp, sarcastic questioning. And he wasn't going to hold back. As the show's theme music played, the crowd erupted in applause. The cheers, however, were mixed with a low murmur of boos from some in the audience. The room was divided. Some cheered for Kimmel's brand of late-night humor, while others, mostly those who sympathized with the Trump administration, watched Leavitt with a quiet reverence. Kimmel's voice cut through the noise as the cameras rolled. Tonight's guest, he began with his usual dramatic flair, is from the White House. I hope she brought a map to navigate my questions. The audience burst into laughter, a mix of delight and expectation. They knew the comedic gauntlet had been thrown, but Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch. She didn't even twitch. She simply smiled, her eyes sharp and focused. The game was on. Leavitt stood with grace, her heels clicking against the stage. As she made her way to the guest chair, her movements were deliberate, confident, each step sending a message to the audience. She wasn't there to engage in a comedy sketch or be reduced to a political punchline. She was there to fight for the truth. Good to have you, Karoline, Kimmel said, his voice still light, though there was an underlying edge. Tell me, what's it like being the face of the White House? Or should I say, the cleanup crew for the president's tweet storms? The laughter that followed was loud. The audience waiting to see how Leavitt would respond. Leavitt's expression didn't change. She looked straight at Kimmel, her eyes unwavering. I'm proud, Jimmy. Proud to represent millions of Americans. Not the ones sitting here twisting the truth for laughs, she replied, her voice steady but cutting through the humor like a sharp blade. The room fell silent for a moment. Some in the audience, especially those who supported the administration, clapped in quiet approval, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Kimmel raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the sharpness of her response, but he wasn't about to back down. ODOT coming in strong. I like that, Kimmel said, his tone still mocking, though he was clearly caught off guard. But honestly, don't you ever feel like your job is a bit like doing comedy? You're out there every day cleaning up the mess. Leavitt didn't hesitate. Comedy. No, Jimmy. I leave that to you, she said, her voice calm but firm. I'm here to say what needs to be said, not perform tricks for an audience. The applause was louder this time, a clear sign that some were growing tired of Kimmel's jokes at the expense of the administration. Kimmel, trying to regain control of the narrative, pressed on. All right, he said, you represent the people. But let's talk about the economy. How do you explain that under the president's watch? Prices are rising. Kimmel's question wasn't just a jab, it was a loaded one, meant to shift the conversation into deeper waters. The audience held its breath, waiting for Leavitt's response. This was it, the moment when Kimmel would try to land a blow. Leavitt sat up straighter, her eyes now locked onto Kimmel, as though nothing else mattered. Rising prices, Jimmy, are a global issue, not just an American one. What's important to remember is that under this administration, we've protected jobs and reduced our dependence on foreign nations, she replied, her voice cutting through the noise of the studio. You've talked about the economy, but have you ever talked about the millions who kept their jobs because of our policies? she asked. Or do you just pick the numbers that fit your narrative? For a brief moment, the audience was silent, stunned by the clarity and directness of her response. Then, like a wave, applause broke out. Leavitt's supporters in the crowd cheered louder than before, drowning out the laughter that had preceded her answer. Kimmel's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, I love numbers, especially when they crash," he said, trying to brush off the tension with another jab. Laughter rippled through the crowd, but it didn't have the same energy as before. Leavitt's confidence was beginning to shift the dynamics in the room. Market fluctuations are normal. "Jimmy," Leavitt continued, her tone unwavering. "But you know what's not normal? People like you spending entire shows twisting the truth instead of asking real questions." The audience's reaction was immediate, splitting into cheers and boos. The tension in the room had reached its peak. Kimmel's smile was still in place, but now there was an unmistakable flicker of discomfort in his eyes. He wasn't expecting this. He had underestimated her. Kimmel, clearly trying to regain control, leaned forward. His voice became sharper. "Real questions? Huh. Fine. Let's talk about the president's statements. Some of them, let's say, are hard to verify. How do you explain that?" Leavitt's eyes didn't waver. She wasn't afraid of this line of questioning. "Polite. That's a new word for you, isn't it?" she said with a cold grin, causing a ripple of laughter from her supporters. "I'm not here to play word games. Jimmy, the president says what he believes, and I'm here to clarify what needs to be clarified." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But if you want to talk about something hard to verify, why don't you address how your show edits words to turn everything into a punchline?" The room shook with applause. This wasn't just a political confrontation. It was a battle for the truth. Kimmel had tried to make this a performance, but Leavitt wasn't playing his game. "Editing words. Huh," Kimmel muttered, clearly rattled but not willing to back down. He raised his hand to calm the crowd, but the applause kept rolling in. It was clear now that this wasn't going the way he'd planned. Leavitt turned her gaze back to the audience, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Folks, I know you came here for fun, but you deserve more than cheap jokes. You deserve to hear the truth about what's really happening in this country, about what we're doing to build a stronger America." Her words rang out like a clarion call, and the crowd roared in approval, chanting her name. Kimmel, his smile fading into a strained mask, tried to speak. But his words were drowned out by the deafening applause. This wasn't just a political fight. It was a battle for the very soul of the narrative, a battle that Karoline Leavitt was winning. And Jimmy Kimmel, for the first time in his career, was losing control. The stage lights felt brighter now, as if they were spotlighting not just Leavitt, but the truth she was so resolutely defending. It was clear to everyone watching that this was no longer a comedy show. It had become something far more powerful, and Leavitt was the one leading the charge. The studio buzzed with anticipation as the confrontation reached its boiling point. Kimmel, ever the master of wit and sarcasm, had been caught off guard by Karoline Leavitt's steadfastness and precision. He had expected a routine political interview, one that would end with him landing a few jabs at the expense of the Trump administration. But now, his usual tactics seemed to be backfiring. The once cocky late-night host was visibly flustered, struggling to regain control of the conversation. "All right, Karoline, let's move on," Kimmel said. His voice slightly strained. He leaned back in his chair, but his eyes never left her, sharp and calculating. "You're here to represent the people, right? So let's talk about the people, the ones who are hurting. How do you justify the fact that, under this administration, so many Americans are struggling to make ends meet? Higher gas prices, higher food prices. People can't afford to live like this." The crowd, which had been split in its loyalties, quieted as Kimmel pushed forward, hoping to land a direct blow. But Leavitt, unmoved, didn't flinch. Instead, she looked him dead in the eyes, her expression unwavering, her voice as steady as ever. "Struggling. Jimmy, let's talk about who's really struggling," she said, her words slicing through the tension. "People like you, sitting on your stage making jokes, while real Americans working families. The backbone of this country are being forgotten. They're the ones who are struggling. Jimmy, not the ones sitting in their comfortable studios, laughing at their expense." The audience reacted again, some clapping, others murmuring uneasily. Kimmel, taken aback by her defiant stance, tried to laugh it off. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. He had underestimated her. This wasn't the usual political hack who would buckle under his pressure. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just there to answer questions. She was there to make her case, to challenge the narrative. Comfortable studios. Really, Karoline, do you think that's the problem? Kimmel's voice edged with sarcasm. Or maybe you just can't see the bigger picture. How do you expect the American people to believe in this administration when the prices are sky high? And they're the ones footing the bill for your so-called policies. Leavitt's eyes narrowed as she prepared to strike back. She wasn't about to let Kimmel manipulate the narrative. The audience was waiting for her response, and she was determined to deliver. You want to talk about higher prices? Jimmy, let's talk about the reasons behind it, she said, her voice calm yet tinged with the kind of authority that came from knowing the facts. Prices are rising because of global supply chain disruptions and factors that are out of our control. But what you won't tell your audience is how this administration has boosted American manufacturing, how we've reduced our reliance on foreign imports, and how, despite everything, 3 million new jobs were created last year. That's the reality, Jimmy. And that's the truth you're not telling your audience. For a moment, there was silence. Kimmel's expression faltered. He had been expecting a politician's usual dodging, but Leavitt wasn't playing his game. She was on the offensive now, her words cutting through the smoke and mirrors he had so often used to dominate political guests. The crowd, which had been divided in its loyalties, was starting to rally behind her. Okay, I get it, Kimmel muttered, trying to regain control. You're really good with numbers. I'll give you that. But do you honestly expect us to believe that all of this is because of global issues? What about the president himself? How do you justify his constant gaffes? And let's be honest, his inability to keep things straight. Leavitt's face didn't change. She leaned forward slightly, a calm but fierce confidence radiating from her. Gaffes? Jimmy, she repeated, her voice sharp. Let's talk about who's really making a mess of things. Maybe you should ask yourself why every time the president speaks, it's the media that twists his words to fit their narrative. You're more interested in making him out to be some kind of joke than actually reporting the truth. The audience shifted again. Kimmel's words had clearly hit a nerve, but Leavitt wasn't backing down. The tension in the room was palpable, a battle of words between the two of them. Leavitt's supporters cheered again, and Kimmel could feel the weight of their disapproval. Kimmel, trying to regain his footing, shifted in his chair. Karoline, it's one thing to sit here and tell me how great everything is, but it's another thing to address the real questions the American people are asking. How do you explain the president's endless Twitter rants, his chaotic decisions? How do you defend that? Chaotic decisions. Leavitt shot back, her eyes flashing. What's chaotic about standing up for Americans? What's chaotic about putting America first, protecting American jobs, and ensuring that we're not dependent on foreign powers for our energy or our economy? Maybe the real chaos is watching the media spin everything into a crisis just to make headlines. Kimmel was clearly struggling to maintain control. He leaned forward, trying to regain the upper hand. You're good. I'll give you that, he said, his voice tinged with grudging respect. But let's be honest here, Karoline. At the end of the day, you're still defending a president who has turned this country into a laughingstock. What are you going to say about that? Leavitt didn't miss a beat. A laughingstock. No, Jimmy. The only thing that's a joke is how the media like you twist every single thing he does. You want to talk about a laughingstock. Look at the last 8 years. Look at the mess the country was in before this administration took over. The audience erupted once again. And this time, the applause was deafening. Kimmel, his composure slipping, raised his hand to quiet the crowd, but it was clear he had lost the narrative. You may not like the way he does things, but at least the president is standing up for the people who have been forgotten, Leavitt continued, her voice resolute. You're sitting up there, mocking him for what? For standing up for workers, for families, for the ones who've been ignored by politicians like you for decades. Kimmel, now visibly rattled, tried to interject, but Leavitt wasn't done. You want to talk about real questions. Here's a real question, Jimmy. Who do you stand for? The elite, the ones who sit in their ivory towers, or the people who actually get things done, who roll up their sleeves and fight for a better future? The crowd responded with another wave of cheers, louder than before. Kimmel, his face tightening, could feel the tide turning against him. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a battle he hadn't been prepared for. Leavitt wasn't just defending her boss, she was defending an entire philosophy, one that Kimmel and his audience were struggling to understand. As the applause continued to swell, Kimmel had no choice but to sit back, momentarily defeated by the sheer force of Leavitt's words. The battle was far from over, but at this moment, it was clear that the truth had a voice, and that voice was Karoline Leavitt's. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted. What started as a typical late-night interview had morphed into a battle of ideals, with the two combatants standing at odds. The once confident Jimmy Kimmel now seemed to be on the defensive. His usual charm and wit weren't enough to shake the poise and conviction of Karoline Leavitt. Kimmel, visibly frustrated but unwilling to admit defeat, leaned in with renewed determination. He was a seasoned host, accustomed to handling political guests. But this felt different. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. He had tried to make her crack, to slip into a political gaffe or a moment of hesitation. But Karoline wasn't backing down, you know? Karoline, Kimmel began, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. I get it. You're here to defend the president and his policies. But let's be real. The world sees what's happening here. The economy's in shambles. Gas prices are up, and people are struggling. And yet, you sit here talking about jobs and global issues. How can you ignore the very real pain that's hitting people every day? Leavitt's expression didn't change. She sat upright in her chair, eyes locked onto Kimmel's, unfazed by his latest jab. The crowd's murmurs were growing louder as they sensed the escalation. There was something more to this conversation than just politics. It was a clash of worldviews. Real pain. Jimmy. Leavitt's voice was steady, but there was a steel edge beneath her calm tone. You're right, people are struggling. But you're forgetting something. This administration isn't just sitting idly by. We're fighting for the very people you claim to represent. You want to talk about gas prices. Let's talk about how this administration has increased domestic oil production by 15%, or how we've created 300,000 new jobs in the energy sector. You want to see a real recovery. Look at the job numbers. Jimmy, look at what we've done for working families. The audience responded with a round of applause. The energy in the room had shifted in her favor. Kimmel, though still smiling, could feel the pressure mounting. His usual quick-witted responses weren't landing as they should. His audience, once fully in his camp, was starting to question the narrative he was pushing. Okay, Kimmel retorted, trying to maintain control of the situation. But those jobs you're talking about, are they really sustainable? Can you explain to the average American how they're supposed to get by when prices keep rising and wages don't keep up? You keep touting these numbers, but can you really stand by them when the cost of living is skyrocketing? Leavitt's eyes never wavered. She wasn't just defending the administration, she was pushing back against the very notion that the media and people like Kimmel had manipulated the truth for their own narrative. Let me tell you something. Jimmy, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. Before this administration, millions of American jobs were lost to terrible trade deals, offshoring, and foreign reliance. And now, we're bringing them back. You want to focus on short-term price hikes. Fine. But don't ignore the long-term impact. We're investing in American industries. We're creating jobs that will outlast these price spikes. And let's not forget, unemployment is at 3.5%, the lowest in 50 years. The words hung in the air, challenging Kimmel to respond. He wasn't used to being the one questioned. He was the one who usually asked the tough questions. But this time, the tables had turned. The crowd could feel it, the balance had shifted. Leavitt wasn't just a political spokesperson, she was a force to be reckoned with. Kimmel, looking for any opening to regain his footing, asked the question he had been saving for last. It was his trump card, the one he hoped would finally make her slip. But Karoline, he said, his tone sharpening, how do you justify the president's behavior on social media? You talk about jobs, you talk about policies, but what about the constant chaos he creates with his Twitter rants? How do you defend that? For a moment, the studio fell silent. The question was the one Kimmel had been waiting for, the one he hoped would finally break through Leavitt's defense. The audience leaned in, waiting for her to falter, to show some sign of weakness. Leavitt's response was immediate, her voice calm and composed as ever. The president speaks his mind, and I'll defend that. But what you won't admit, Jimmy, is how the media distorts every word he says. The same media that takes his tweets out of context. The same media that spins every action into chaos. You want to talk about chaos? Look at the way the media twists the truth to fit their narrative. I'm here to tell the truth, not play into your games. The audience erupted into applause, some standing to cheer her on. The sound was deafening, filling the studio with an energy that was impossible to ignore. Kimmel tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time in a long time, he was being outplayed on his own stage. Look, Jimmy, Leavitt continued, her gaze unshaken. This isn't about me or the president. It's about the American people. They deserve to know the truth. They deserve more than jokes and sound bites. They deserve facts, and that's what I'm here to give them. Kimmel's face hardened, but he could feel the tide turning. He had come into this interview expecting to walk all over Leavitt, to make her squirm, to expose her vulnerabilities. But she had done the opposite. She had stood her ground, turning the conversation into a lesson on the power of truth. You're good, Karoline, Kimmel said, his voice tinged with reluctance. But if you really believe all this, why are you sitting here defending a president who's made a mess of things? Leavitt didn't flinch. The mess, Jimmy, is what happened before. We're cleaning it up, and we're doing it for the people who've been ignored for too long. I'm not defending a man. I'm defending a movement. And if that scares you, then maybe you need to take a step back and look at who the real messengers are. The applause was louder this time, overwhelming the last remnants of Kimmel's control over the room. The audience wasn't just watching a political interview anymore. They were witnessing a battle for truth. And in that moment, it was clear who had won. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just holding her ground. She had turned the tables, exposing Kimmel's own biases while standing firmly behind the policies she believed in. The battle was far from over, but Leavitt had made one thing clear: truth, not theatrics, would win the day. Kimmel's usual self-assurance was starting to crack. He had been the king of late-night television for years, expertly steering political guests into uncomfortable positions. But tonight was different. Karoline Leavitt had done more than just defend the president's policies. She had flipped the script, exposing Kimmel's biases while remaining calm and composed under pressure. The room was electric with tension. The audience, which had initially been split, was now firmly in Leavitt's corner. Kimmel, trying to salvage his reputation as the sharp-witted host, struggled to find his rhythm. He had expected this interview to be another victory, another comedic takedown, but instead, it had turned into a dramatic clash of ideologies, one that he was quickly losing. Well, Karoline, Kimmel said, forcing a smile as he leaned forward again, trying to regain control of the conversation. I have to hand it to you. You're tough. But tell me this, do you honestly believe everything is going well in this country? How do you sleep at night knowing the president's approval rating is lower than ever? Leavitt's gaze didn't waver. She was like a warrior standing her ground in the face of an unrelenting adversary. The audience held its breath, sensing that Kimmel's attempt to pivot was the final challenge. Approval ratings, Leavitt echoed, her voice steady but sharp. Approval ratings don't measure the success of a country. What matters is the work we've done, the jobs we've created, the economy we've revived, and the American workers we've protected. You can focus on numbers and polls, Jimmy, but at the end of the day, we've delivered results, and the American people know it. The clarity in her voice made Kimmel pause for a brief moment. The studio was dead silent. He had been expecting another chance to discredit her, to score one final point. But Leavitt had taken that away, dismantling his argument piece by piece with facts and poise. Well, you've certainly given me a lot to think about, Kimmel said, his voice now tinged with bitterness, trying to recover some dignity. But the cracks in his confidence were showing. Leavitt didn't give him the chance to go further. No, Jimmy, the truth is already here. You just don't want to see it. She stood up slowly, her red suit almost glowing under the lights. And you can't twist it or joke your way out of it anymore. The audience erupted in a standing ovation, drowning out Kimmel's last attempts to regain control. The fight had been won, not with loud speeches or flashy tactics, but with calm, calculated truth. Leavitt had stood her ground, and, in doing so, had delivered the final blow. As the applause continued to swell, Kimmel, now seated in stunned silence, could only watch as Leavitt walked off the stage, her head held high. She had turned his world of comedy into a battlefield of truth. and in the end, it was the truth that triumphed. The studio was still buzzing with energy, the air thick with the aftermath of the showdown. The applause for Karoline Leavitt had barely faded, and the echoes of support from the audience lingered in the room like a victory chant. Kimmel sat behind his desk, his usual confidence drained, his smile now a thin mask, barely concealing the unease he felt. He had underestimated her, and in that moment, he knew it. Leavitt had walked off the stage with grace, her head held high, her every step radiating unshakable confidence. She didn't need to say another word. She had said it all. Her calmness, her facts, her unwavering commitment to the truth had completely shifted the dynamics of the evening. Kimmel, who had expected to land punchline after punchline, had been left scrambling for words, forced to confront the reality that his usual tactics no longer had the same power. Behind the scenes, Kimmel's production team was already in damage control mode. Producers whispered into headsets, and staff rushed around, trying to make sense of the chaos that had just unfolded. She stole the show. One producer muttered under her breath, "Ratings will be high, but at what cost?" Kimmel, still at the desk, tried to regain some semblance of control. He straightened his suit, wiped his brow, and forced a smile as he turned back to the camera. "Well, folks," he began, his voice trying to sound upbeat but strained. "That was an interesting night. We'll be right back after the break." The audience clapped politely, but the energy was not the same. There was no roaring laughter, no sense of triumph. The atmosphere had shifted, and Kimmel could feel it. Leavitt's exit had not only been a physical departure from the stage, it was a metaphorical mic drop, a statement that resonated far beyond the confines of the studio. The truth she had spoken continued to echo, reverberating through social media and news outlets. The reactions poured in like a tidal wave. On Twitter, hashtags like #LeavittRules and #KimmelSchooled dominated the trending topics. Clips of Leavitt's calm yet forceful responses were shared millions of times, with users praising her for standing up to Kimmel's attacks with nothing but the truth. In just a matter of hours, her social media following surged, with new supporters declaring their admiration for her bravery. Fox News wasted no time in covering the aftermath, with the headline, "Karoline Leavitt annihilates Jimmy Kimmel" on his own show. Other conservative outlets quickly followed suit, calling her performance a masterclass in political combat. Even some neutral viewers, typically disinterested in the partisan divide, acknowledged Leavitt's composure and strength. Meanwhile, Kimmel's side of the media sphere was less enthusiastic. His followers defended him. But many couldn't ignore the stark contrast between his usual control of the narrative and the way he had been upstaged by a younger, more determined voice. The late-night host had become a symbol of media bias for many, a punching bag for those who had grown tired of the partisan humor that often passed for political discourse. Kimmel sat back in his chair, staring at the monitor, trying to process what had just happened. The ratings would likely skyrocket, but the cost of the viral moment was becoming clear. His quick-witted, sarcastic approach had worked for years, but tonight it had failed him. He had faced a political adversary who wasn't interested in playing the game by his rules. Karoline Leavitt had turned his stage into a battlefield, and in the end, the truth had been the victor. Back at the White House, Leavitt walked through the hallways with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The internal feedback was already flooding in. Her colleagues praised her for holding her ground and taking the fight to the media. The victory had been more than just a personal one. It was a win for the administration's message. In a world where truth was often overshadowed by sensationalism and mockery, Leavitt had proven that courage, facts, and clarity could still break through. As she walked into her office, the buzz of the night still lingered in her mind. She wasn't done. The battle had just begun. The morning after the interview, the media was still buzzing. Karoline Leavitt had become a national sensation. Clips of her calm, powerful responses to Jimmy Kimmel's barbs flooded social media, quickly racking up millions of views. She had transformed a late-night comedy show into a political battleground, and in doing so, redefined what it meant to stand up for the truth. Kimmel's attempt to mock and diminish her had backfired. The applause she received from the audience was not just for her performance on the stage, but for her ability to maintain her integrity and her composure under pressure. It was a lesson in how to confront media bias with facts, poise, and confidence. For Leavitt, The victory wasn't just personal, it was a message to the world that truth could still stand strong in the face of satire, jokes, and media manipulation. As she walked into her next briefing, she knew her legacy had already begun. This was just the beginning of a new chapter for her, one that would reshape the narrative for many to come.